The deafening crack of Harold Thompson's hand against Hazel's cheek echoed through their modest cabin as she stumbled backward, nearly falling over the rough-hewn kitchen table. Colorado Territory, 1872, was no place for a woman alone, but as she touched her fingertips to the warm trickle of blood at the corner of her mouth, Hazel wondered if being alone could possibly be worse than this. "You think anyone's gonna believe you?" Harold snarled, his face contorted with rage, spittle flying from his lips. "You're nothing without me. Nothing." Hazel steadied herself against the table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. 3 years of marriage had taught her when to speak and when to remain silent. This moment demanded silence. Harold paced the floor, his boots heavy against the wooden planks. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the window, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air between them. Hazel watched him carefully, calculating his movements like prey watches a predator. "I'm going to town," he announced, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. "Don't expect me back till morning, and this place better be spotless when I return." The door slammed behind him with such force that a small china figurine, the only keepsake from Hazel's mother, toppled from the shelf and shattered on the floor. She didn't move to pick up the pieces until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Only then did she allow herself to sink to her knees, carefully gathering the broken fragments of porcelain. Tears blurred her vision as she collected each piece, knowing it could never be whole again. Much like her life, she thought bitterly, Hazel had once been full of dreams. At 22, she had married Harold, believing in love and the promise of a new life in the West. Now, at 25, she felt decades older, her spirit crushed beneath the weight of his cruelty. As she placed the broken pieces on the table, a plan began to form in her mind. Harold wouldn't return until morning. For once, she knew exactly where he would be drinking and gambling at the Silver Dollar Saloon in town. She had time, not much, but perhaps enough. With trembling hands, Hazel packed a small bundle, a change of clothes, the meager savings she had secretly squirreled away over months, and a locket containing a small portrait of her parents. She changed her dress, wincing as the fabric brushed against the bruises on her ribs from last week's beating. She had no clear destination in mind. The nearest town, Willow Creek, was 15 miles away, too far to walk before nightfall, but 5 miles north was the McCready Ranch. She had met the elderly couple at church several times before Harold had forbidden her from attending. Perhaps they would offer her shelter for the night. Hazel took one last look around the cabin that had been her prison for 3 years. Then, with her bundle clutched to her chest, she stepped out into the fading daylight. The evening air was cool against her face as she set out along the dirt path leading north. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see Harold's silhouette on the horizon. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her mouth was dry with fear, but her feet carried her forward, one step after another. As the sun dipped below the mountains, casting the valley in deepening shadows, Hazel quickened her pace. The thought of being caught in the open after dark filled her with dread. Wild animals weren't her only concern. Harold had friends in the area, men who wouldn't hesitate to return a runaway wife to her husband. The first stars were appearing in the twilight sky when Hazel heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Panic seized her as she looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. The road here was bordered by open meadow, no trees or brush offered concealment. She froze, her breath caught in her throat as a rider appeared over the rise ahead. The silhouette was unfamiliar, not Harold's hulking frame, but that of a stranger. As he drew closer, she could make out more details. A tall man astride a chestnut mare, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The rider slowed as he approached, and Hazel clutched her bundle tighter, ready to run though she knew it would be futile. "Evening, madam," the stranger called, his voice deep but gentle. "You're a fair piece from town to be walking alone at this hour." Hazel remained silent, her eyes darting to the road behind her, calculating whether she should try to flee. The man seemed to sense her fear. He stopped his horse several yards away and removed his hat, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. He wasn't young, perhaps in his mid-30s, but there was a strength about him that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "Name's Henry Walsh," he said, inclining his head slightly. "I mean no harm, madam, just concerned to see a lady walking alone so close to nightfall." Hazel swallowed hard, finding her voice at last. I'm heading to the McCready Ranch." Henry's expression changed subtly. "I'm afraid you won't find help there, madam. The McCreadys sold up and moved back east 3 months ago. Their place stands empty now." Hazel felt the last of her hope drain away. She had no other plan, nowhere else to go. Henry studied her face in the fading light, and his eyes narrowed slightly as they took in the darkening bruise on her cheek that she had unsuccessfully tried to hide with her bonnet. "You in some kind of trouble, madam?" he asked quietly. Hazel looked down at the dusty road. "No, sir, I'm fine." "With all due respect," Henry said, his voice still gentle, "you don't look fine." Something in his tone, concern without judgment, made Hazel look up and meet his gaze. What she saw there wasn't pity or scorn, but a genuine worry that broke through the walls she had built around herself. "My husband," she began, then faltered, years of shame and fear making the words stick in her throat. Henry nodded slowly, understanding without her having to explain further. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles east of here," he said. "My sister keeps house for me. You'd be welcome to stay the night, get your bearings." Hazel hesitated, weighing the risk of trusting this stranger against the certainty of what awaited her if she returned home or was caught on the road. Seeming to read her thoughts, Henry dismounted, keeping a respectful distance between them. "I'll walk alongside you, madam. You can keep hold of the reins if you'd like. Flora here is gentle as a lamb." He extended the reins toward her, an offering of trust that touched something deep within Hazel. With a trembling hand, she reached out and took them. "Thank you," she whispered. As they walked together in the gathering darkness, Hazel felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. The journey to Henry's ranch passed in relative silence. Hazel was grateful that he didn't press her for details about her situation, though she could feel his occasional glance, taking in her appearance, the bruise on her cheek, the way she held herself as if protecting injured ribs, the wariness in her eyes. The ranch appeared as they crested a small hill, a modest but well-maintained house with a large barn and several outbuildings. Warm light spilled from the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney into the night sky. As they approached, the front door opened and a woman stood silhouetted against the light. "Henry, that you?" she called. "It's me, Hannah," Henry replied. "And we have a guest." Hannah Walsh was perhaps a few years older than Hazel, with the same kind eyes as her brother. She took in Hazel's appearance with a quick, assessing glance, but asked no questions as she ushered them inside. "You must be frozen through," she said, guiding Hazel to a chair by the fire. "Let me fetch you some tea." The interior of the Walsh home was simple but comfortable, a far cry from the sparse, neglected cabin she shared with Harold. Here, colorful quilts draped over furniture, shelves lined with books occupied one wall, and the smell of fresh bread and stew filled the air. Henry removed his coat and hat, hanging them by the door before excusing himself to tend to his horse. Hannah returned with a steaming cup of tea, which Hazel accepted gratefully. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," Hannah said, settling into a chair across from Hazel. "We don't get many visitors out here, but our door is always open to those who need shelter." Hazel's hands trembled around the warm cup. "I don't want to impose, just one night and then you'll decide what comes next," Hannah finished for her. "There's no rush." When Henry returned, Hannah served bowls of hearty stew and slices of fresh bread. Hazel couldn't remember the last time she'd had such a satisfying meal. Harold often criticized her cooking, sometimes throwing plates against the wall in rage if the meal didn't meet his standards. After dinner, Hannah showed Hazel to a small but clean bedroom. "There's water in the pitcher if you'd like to wash," she said, placing a folded nightgown on the bed. It might be a bit large on you, but it's clean." Left alone, Hazel sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the kindness of these strangers. She changed into the borrowed nightgown, wincing as she raised her arms and the fabric slid over the mottled bruises on her torso. Sleep came fitfully that night, haunted by dreams of Harold finding her, dragging her back to their cabin, his hands around her throat. Each time she woke with a start, it took several moments to remember where she was safe, at least for now. Morning brought pale sunlight streaming through the curtains and the aroma of coffee and bacon. Hazel dressed quickly in her own clothes, smoothed her hair as best she could, and made her way to the kitchen. Hannah was at the stove, flipping bacon in a cast iron skillet. She smiled warmly at Hazel. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you," Hazel lied politely. "Henry's already out tending to the stock," Hannah said, placing a plate of food before Hazel. "He'll be in shortly." As they ate, Hannah chatted about inconsequential things: the weather, her vegetable garden, a new calf born the previous week. She didn't ask about Hazel's circumstances or the bruises that were now more prominent in the morning light. When Henry joined them, bringing with him the scent of fresh air and horses, he nodded a greeting to Hazel but likewise made no mention of her situation. Instead, he discussed ranch matters with his sister and inquired if Hazel had slept comfortably. After breakfast, Hazel insisted on helping with the dishes. As they worked side by side, Hannah finally broached the subject Hazel had been dreading. "My brother and I came west after losing our parents to fever," she said conversationally. "Henry was 22, I was 18. We had nothing but each other and a wagon full of belongings." Hazel listened, wondering where this story was leading. "5 years we've been here now," Hannah continued. "Built this place from nothing." She paused, glancing at Hazel. "What I'm saying is, we understand what it means to start over. And sometimes that's what needs doing." Hazel's hands stilled in the wash basin. "My husband," she began hesitantly, "he'll be looking for me." Hannah nodded. "I figured as much. Those bruises didn't come from nowhere." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes and she blinked them back. "I don't know what to do," she admitted in a whisper. "He'll find me eventually, he always does." Hannah placed a gentle hand on Hazel's arm. "You don't have to decide everything today. Stay here a while, gather your strength." "I couldn't impose, it's not an imposition," Hannah interrupted firmly. "We could use the help, truth be told. I've been after Henry to hire someone, but he's too stubborn to admit he can't manage it all himself." Hazel hesitated. The offer was tempting: a safe place, kind people. But the fear of Harold finding her, of bringing his rage down on these good people, weighed heavily on her conscience. "He's dangerous," she said quietly. "I wouldn't want to put you at risk." Hannah's expression hardened slightly. "My brother can handle himself, and so can I. We're not strangers to hardship or to standing our ground." Before Hazel could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Henry appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. "Riders coming," he said. 2 men moving fast. Hazel's heart lurched. "Harold," she whispered, panic rising in her throat. Henry's gaze met hers. "Is that your husband's name?" She nodded, unable to speak through her fear. "Hannah, take Hazel to the root cellar," Henry said calmly, reaching for the rifle mounted above the door. "Stay there until I come for you." Hannah didn't hesitate. She grabbed Hazel's hand and led her swiftly through the kitchen to a trapdoor concealed beneath a rug. They descended into darkness, Hannah pulling the door closed above them. In the dim light filtering through the cracks, Hannah lit a small lantern, revealing shelves stocked with preserved foods and a small bench against one wall. "Sit," she instructed, "and try to breathe slowly." Hazel sank onto the bench, her entire body trembling. "He'll hurt Henry," she whispered. "He's strong and he has no restraint when he's angry." Hannah sat beside her, taking Hazel's cold hands in her warm ones. "My brother is stronger than he looks, and he's not alone." Above them, they could hear muffled voices, Henry's measured tones, then another voice, louder and more aggressive. Harold's voice, demanding to know if Henry had seen his wife. Hazel closed her eyes, imagining the scene above Harold's face red with rage, his hands clenched into fists. She had seen that expression too many times, had felt those fists against her body. The voices grew louder, more heated. Then a crash, as if furniture had been overturned. Hazel started to rise, but Hannah held her firmly in place. "Trust Henry," she whispered, more sounds of struggle than a gunshot that made both women flinch. Silence followed, stretching out unbearably until Hazel thought she might scream from the tension. Finally, footsteps approached the trapdoor, and it lifted to reveal Henry's face, a cut above his eyebrow but otherwise unharmed. "It's safe now," he said, extending his hand to help them up. Hazel emerged into the kitchen to find it in disarray, a chair overturned, a shelf of dishes knocked to the floor. Through the open door, she could see two horses galloping away, one carrying Harold's bulky frame, the other his friend from town. "Are you hurt?" she asked Henry, reaching instinctively toward the cut on his face. He shook his head. "Just a scratch. Your husband decided not to press the issue when he found himself looking down the barrel of my rifle." Relief flooded through Hazel, quickly followed by dread. "He'll be back," she said. "With more men, probably." "Let him come," Henry said, his voice calm but determined. "This is my land and you're under my protection now." Hazel shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I can't let you put yourselves at risk for me. I should go get further away." Henry took a step closer, his gaze steady on hers. "Running isn't always the answer, Mrs." He paused. "I don't even know your full name." "Hazel Thompson," she supplied, "though I wish I'd never taken his name." "Miss Hazel, then," Henry said. "I meant what I said." "You're welcome here for as long as you need." Hannah moved to clean up the broken dishes, adding, "Besides, where would you go? The nearest town is Willow Creek, and he'd find you there easy enough." Hazel knew they were right. She had no money for a stagecoach ticket, no family to flee to, no skills that would allow her to support herself in a larger town. "I could work," she offered. "Earn my keep. I'm a good cook and I can sew." Henry and Hannah exchanged a glance. "We could certainly use the help," Hannah admitted. "Especially with the garden. I've more than I can manage with the house and the chickens." "And I could use someone to help with the books," Henry added. "Hannah tries, but numbers aren't her strong suit." "I told you they move around on the page," Hannah retorted, a hint of humor in her voice despite the circumstances. Their easy banter, even in this tense moment, touched something in Hazel. This was how a family should be supportive, teasing without cruelty, standing together against threats. "If you're sure," she said hesitantly. Henry's expression softened. "We're sure, but we should be prepared. Your husband knows you're in the area now." "He won't give up easily," Hazel warned. "Neither will we," Henry replied, his voice carrying a quiet determination that, for the first time, made Hazel believe she might truly have found sanctuary. The next few days passed in a rhythm unlike anything Hazel had experienced in her married life. She rose early, helping Hannah with breakfast before the two women tackled household chores. The afternoons found Hazel in the garden, tending to vegetables and herbs with a care she hadn't been able to show in her own small plot behind the cabin, where Harold's criticism had sapped the joy from the task. Henry spent most days working with the cattle or mending fences, but he made a point to check on Hazel throughout the day, his quiet presence a reassurance rather than a threat. In the evenings, they gathered around the table for meals, sharing stories and sometimes reading aloud from one of the books on the shelves. Gradually, Hazel felt the constant tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The bruises on her face and body faded, though the deeper wounds, the ones that couldn't be seen, remained tender to the touch. One evening, a week after her arrival, Hazel sat on the porch with Henry as the sun set over the distant mountains. Hannah had retired early with a headache, leaving them alone in the gathering dusk. "I was thinking," Henry said after a comfortable silence, "that we might ride into town tomorrow. Hannah needs supplies and you might want some things of your own." Hazel stiffened. "Harold could be there." "Possibly," Henry acknowledged, "but you can't hide forever, And it might do you good to show your face, let people see you're not some criminal on the run." Hazel considered his words. She had been a virtual prisoner in her own home for so long that the thought of walking freely through town seemed both thrilling and terrifying. "Will you stay with me?" she asked, hating the tremor in her voice. Henry turned to look at her, his expression serious in the fading light. "Every step," he promised. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Hazel dressed in a borrowed dress from Hannah, a simple blue cotton that fit her better than expected. Hannah helped her arrange her hair, pinning it neatly beneath a modest bonnet. "There," Hannah said, standing back to admire her work. "You look lovely." Hazel glanced in the small mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. The bruises had faded to faint yellowish marks, and there was a hint of color in her cheeks that hadn't been there before. Henry waited by the wagon, offering his hand to help Hazel climb up to the seat. Hannah sat in the back, surrounded by empty baskets ready to be filled with supplies. The journey to Willow Creek took just over an hour, during which Hazel's anxiety grew with each mile. By the time the town came into view, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap. Henry seemed to sense her distress. "Remember," he said quietly, "you've done nothing wrong." Hazel nodded, though she couldn't quite believe it. Years of Harold's accusations had left their mark, convincing her that every misfortune was somehow her fault. They pulled up in front of the general store, and Henry helped both women down from the wagon. "I'll go check the mail," he said. "Meet you inside in a few minutes." Hazel followed Hannah into the store, trying to ignore the curious glances from the other customers. Willow Creek wasn't large, and news traveled fast. Everyone would know by now that Harold Thompson's wife had run off. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, approached with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hannah Walsh, good to see you," she said, before turning her gaze to Hazel. "And Mrs. Thompson, there's been some talk about you." Hannah stepped slightly in front of Hazel, her voice cool. "Has there?" "Well, you know how people love to gossip." Mrs. Peterson's smile thinned. "Your husband's been asking after you," Mrs. Thompson seemed quite distressed. Hazel swallowed hard. "I'm sure he did." "A wife's place is with her husband," Mrs. Peterson continued, her tone disapproving. The good book also says to love one another and not to bring harm," Hannah interrupted. "Now, we need flour, sugar, coffee, and some fabric if you have any new patterns in." Mrs. Peterson's lips pursed, but she moved behind the counter to begin gathering the requested items. Hazel avoided her gaze, focusing instead on examining a shelf of canned goods. The bell above the door jingled as Henry entered, nodding to the other customers as he made his way to Hazel's side. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly. Before she could answer, the door opened again, and Harold Thompson stepped inside, followed by two other men. The store fell silent as he spotted Hazel, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "There you are," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Time to come home, Hazel." Henry moved subtly to stand between them. "Mrs. Thompson is staying with us for now," he said evenly. Harold's face darkened. "That's my wife you're harboring, Walsh. I could have you arrested." "For what?" Henry asked. "Providing shelter to a woman in need. I don't believe that's against the law." Harold took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "She's my property, and I'm taking her home." A murmur ran through the store at his words. Hazel felt a flash of anger pierce through her fear. Property? Was that truly how he saw her? "I'm not going with you, Harold," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. Harold's gaze snapped to her, surprise momentarily replacing anger. She had rarely defied him, especially in public. "You'll do as I say," he growled. "No," Hazel replied, stepping out from behind Henry to face her husband directly. "I won't." Harold lunged forward, but Henry intercepted him, placing a firm hand on his chest. "That's enough," Henry said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable warning. The two men behind Harold moved forward, hands hovering near their holstered guns. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and Hazel held her breath, terrified of what might happen next. "Is there a problem here?" a new voice asked. Sheriff Daniels stood in the doorway, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the scene. "This man's trying to take my wife," Harold said immediately. "Been keeping her at his ranch against her will." The sheriff's gaze moved to Hazel. "That true, Mrs. Thompson?" Hazel felt all eyes on her, including Harold's burning stare. Fear tightened her throat, but she forced herself to speak. "No, Sheriff, I left of my own accord. Mr. Walsh and his sister have kindly offered me shelter." Sheriff Daniels nodded slowly. "I see," he turned to Harold. "Seems to me there's no crime being committed here, Thompson. A woman's allowed to visit friends." "She's my wife," Harold insisted. "That she is," the sheriff agreed. "But that doesn't make her your prisoner. Now, I suggest you gentlemen continue your business and let these folks do the same." Harold's face contorted with rage, but with the sheriff present, he could do little but glare at Hazel. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low enough that only she and Henry could hear. "You'll be sorry you embarrassed me like this." With that, he stormed out of the store, his friends following close behind. The tension in the room eased somewhat, though curious glances still followed Hazel as she tried to steady her trembling hands. Sheriff Daniels approached her, concern evident in his weathered face. "You all right, Mrs. Thompson?" Hazel nodded, not trusting her voice. "If you need anything at all, you come see me," the sheriff said, his voice gentle. "My door's always open." After he left, Hannah quickly finished their shopping, adding a bolt of cheerful yellow fabric that she pressed into Hazel's hands. "For a new dress," she explained, "something bright." Outside, they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Hazel constantly scanning the street for signs of Harold. He was nowhere to be seen, but she knew better than to believe he had given up. The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Henry keeping a watchful eye on the road behind them. It wasn't until they passed through the gate onto Walsh property that Hazel felt she could breathe again. As Henry helped her down from the wagon, his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. "You were brave today," he said. Hazel shook her head. "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't about not feeling fear," Henry replied. "It's about doing what's right despite it." That evening after dinner, Hannah brought out the yellow fabric and her sewing basket. "Let's get started on your new dress," she said cheerfully. "No time like the present." As the women worked, cutting pattern pieces and pinning them together, Henry sat nearby, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. The domesticity of the scene struck Hazel so different from the tense silence of her evenings with Harold, when she would darn his socks with shaking hands, dreading any movement that might draw his attention. "What are you making?" she asked Henry, nodding toward the piece of wood taking shape in his hands. He held it up, a small figure of a horse, still rough but recognizable. "Just passing the time," he said with a slight shrug. "My father taught me, said idle hands find trouble." "It's beautiful," Hazel said sincerely. A faint color touched Henry's cheeks. "It's nothing special." Hannah rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "He's being modest, he's quite talented. The mantel in my room is full of his carvings." Henry cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "How's the dress coming along?" Hazel held up the partially completed bodice. "It will be lovely," she said, running her fingers over the bright fabric. "I haven't had anything new in, I can't remember how long." A shadow crossed Henry's face. "Your husband didn't provide for you properly." Hazel looked down at her hands. "Harold always said I didn't deserve nice things, that I should be grateful for what I had." The room fell silent, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "Well," Hannah said finally, her voice deliberately bright, "I think every woman deserves something pretty. And this yellow will look wonderful with your coloring." Later that night, as Hazel lay in bed listening to the distant howl of coyotes, she reflected on the day's events. Harold's threat echoed in her mind. This isn't over. She knew him well enough to believe it. He wouldn't rest until he had her back under his control, not because he loved her, but because she was, as he had said, his property. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Hazel, are you awake?" Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. She sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. Yes, the door opened slightly, just enough for Henry to speak without entering. I'm heading out to check the perimeter once more before turning in. Just wanted to let you know. Do you think he'll come tonight? Hazel asked, unable to keep the fear from her voice. There was a pause. I don't know, Henry admitted, but I'd rather be cautious. Be careful, Hazel said. Always am, Henry replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Try to get some sleep. You're safe here. As the door closed, Hazel lay back down, those last words settling over her like a blanket. You're safe here. 3 simple words, yet they carried a weight she could barely comprehend after years of living in constant fear. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually pulled her under, into dreams filled with yellow dresses and wooden horses, and a pair of kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn silence, jolting Hazel from sleep. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then reality crashed back as shouting erupted from the main room of the house. Harold's voice, slurred with drink but unmistakable, bellowed threats and obscenities. Another voice, Henry's, responded more calmly, though with steel beneath the words. Hazel froze, paralyzed by terror. It was happening just as she had feared. Harold had come for her, and now Henry was in danger because of her. The door to her room burst open, and Hannah rushed in, her hair in a long braid down her back, a shotgun in her hands. Get dressed quickly, she instructed. Use the window, run to the barn, and hide in the hayloft. I can't leave you, Hazel began. Now, Hazel, Hannah's voice was urgent. Henry can handle Harold, but there are 2 others with him. Go, hands shaking, Hazel pulled on her dress, not bothering with stockings or proper shoes. The sounds of struggle continued from the main room, a crash, the thud of a body hitting the floor, more shouting. Hannah helped her push open the window, then handed her a small pistol. Do you know how to use this? Hazel shook her head, eyes wide. Point and pull the trigger, Hannah said grimly, but only if you have no choice. Now go. Hazel climbed through the window, dropping awkwardly to the ground below. The cool night air raised goosebumps on her skin as she ran, crouched low toward the barn, the pistol clutched in her trembling hand. Behind her, a gunshot cracked through the night, followed by the sound of breaking furniture. Hazel bit back a sob as she reached the barn door, slipping inside and pulling it closed behind her. The interior was pitch black, the air heavy with the scent of hay and animals. The horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, disturbed by the commotion from the house. Hazel felt her way to the ladder leading to the hayloft, the pistol hampering her climb. Once in the loft, she burrowed into the hay, making herself as small as possible. Through a small window, she could see the house. A lamp illuminated the main room, casting shadows that moved erratically across the curtains. Another gunshot split the night, and Hazel pressed her fist against her mouth to stifle her cry of fear. Had Henry been hit? Or Hannah? The thought of these kind people hurt, or worse, because of her, was unbearable. Minutes stretched like hours as Hazel huddled in the hay, straining to hear anything that might tell her what was happening. Eventually, the shouting died down, replaced by an eerie silence that frightened her even more. Then, footsteps approached the barn, heavy, stumbling footsteps that didn't match Henry's usual steady gait. The barn door creaked open, and a shaft of moonlight illuminated Harold's hulking form as he stepped inside. Hazel, he called, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I know you're in here. Come out now, and maybe I won't kill your farmer friend. Hazel's blood ran cold. Henry, what had Harold done to him? He's still breathing, Harold continued, as if reading her thoughts. For now, but that could change. Harold moved further into the barn, his footsteps uneven. He was drunk, Hazel realized, which made him even more dangerous. Alcohol had always loosened his already tenuous control. You've embarrassed me for the last time, he slurred, stumbling against a stall door. One of the horses snorted in alarm, shying away from him. Everyone in town's talking about how my wife ran off with some rancher. I'm the laughingstock of the county, Hazel remained frozen in the hayloft, the pistol heavy in her hand. She had never fired a gun in her life, had never even held one before tonight. "When I find you," Harold continued, moving toward the ladder, "you'll wish you'd never been born." The threat, one she had heard countless times before, ignited something inside Hazel. A lifetime of fear and submission crystallized into a single, clarifying moment of rage. She would not go back. She would not allow this man to control her ever again. As Harold's hand gripped the ladder, Hazel rose from the hay, pistol aimed downward. "Stop right there, Harold," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Harold looked up, his face contorted with rage and surprise. "So the mouse finally found her voice," he sneered. "Put that gun down before you hurt yourself." "I'm not going with you," Hazel said. "Not now, not ever." Harold's laugh was ugly. "You don't have a choice, wife. Now get down here before I drag you down." He started to climb, and Hazel's finger tightened on the trigger. "I'll shoot," she warned, her voice wavering slightly. "You don't have the spine," Harold retorted, continuing his ascent. The barn door crashed open again, and Henry appeared, blood streaming from a cut on his temple but very much alive. "Thompson," he shouted. "Step away from that ladder." Harold froze, then slowly turned his head to look at Henry. "This doesn't concern you, Walsh. She's my wife." "She's under my protection," Henry replied, his voice hard as iron. Harold sneered. "Your protection? You couldn't even protect yourself. If your sister hadn't winged one of my friends, you'd be dead already." "Hannah," Hazel called, fear clutching at her heart. "Is she?" "She's fine," Henry assured her, his eyes never leaving Harold. Tending to Johnson's arm, man alive, though he might not shoot straight again. Harold took advantage of the momentary distraction to lunge up the last few rungs of the ladder. Hazel screamed and fired the pistol, the recoil shocking her as the bullet went wide, embedding itself in the barn wall. Harold grabbed her ankle, yanking hard enough that she fell, the pistol tumbling from her grasp and disappearing into the hay. He dragged her toward the edge of the loft, his hands reaching for her throat. "You're dead," he snarled. "Both of you." But before his fingers could close around her neck, a shot rang out. Harold's body jerked, then went slack, collapsing half on top of her. Hazel struggled out from under him, gasping for breath. Henry stood at the top of the ladder, a smoking revolver in his hand. His face was grim as he quickly moved to Hazel's side, pulling her away from Harold's motionless form. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his free hand gently tilting her face toward the moonlight streaming through the hayloft window. Hazel shook her head, unable to speak. Harold lay sprawled on the hayloft floor, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "He's alive," Henry said, following her gaze. "Though he might wish he wasn't when he wakes up." He helped Hazel to her feet, keeping his body between her and Harold's unconscious form as they descended the ladder. Outside, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. The house was in disarray when they entered, furniture overturned, a window broken, blood staining the wooden floor. Hannah sat at the table, a rifle across her lap, keeping watch over a man whose arm was wrapped in a makeshift bandage. Another man lay on the floor, his hands bound behind him, a dark bruise forming on his jaw. "Hazel," Hannah breathed, relief evident in her voice. "You're all right, I'm fine," Hazel assured her, though she felt anything but fine. Her whole body trembled with the aftermath of terror and adrenaline. "Thompson?" Hannah asked, looking at her brother. "Alive," Henry replied tersely. "Shot in the shoulder, he's in the hayloft," Hannah nodded. "I'll ride for the sheriff and the doctor." By mid-morning, Sheriff Daniels had arrived with Dr. Morgan in tow. Harold and his wounded friend were loaded into the sheriff's wagon, both men handcuffed despite their injuries. "They'll stand trial for breaking and entering, assault, and attempted murder," the sheriff explained as he prepared to depart. "Most likely they're looking at a good long stretch in territorial prison." Hazel watched from the porch as the wagon pulled away, Harold's unconscious form bouncing with each rut in the road. A complex mixture of emotions churned within her: relief, fear, guilt, and beneath it all, a tentative sense of freedom. "He can't hurt you anymore," Henry said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Hazel nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Harold had been a looming threat for so long that it was difficult to imagine life without that shadow hanging over her. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning up the destruction left by the night's violence. Hannah insisted that Hazel rest, but she couldn't bear to be idle, finding that physical labor helped quiet the tumult in her mind. As she swept broken glass from the floor, Hazel caught Henry watching her, concern evident in his gaze. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I want to help," she replied. "It's the least I can do after all you've risked for me." Henry shook his head. "You don't owe us anything, Hazel." "I owe you everything," she contradicted. "My life, my freedom. I don't know how I'll ever repay such a debt." Henry stepped closer, gently taking the broom from her hands. "There is no debt," he said firmly. "What we did freely." Hazel looked up at him, struck again by the kindness in his eyes. Without thinking, she reached up to touch the bandage Dr. Morgan had applied to the cut on his temple. "You could have been killed." Henry caught her hand in his touch warm and steady. "So could you," he said softly. "But we're both still here." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of the bond that had formed through shared danger. Hazel felt her cheeks warm under his gaze, and she gently withdrew her hand. "I should help Hannah with dinner," she murmured, suddenly shy. Henry nodded, a hint of understanding in his smile. "Of course." That night, after a quiet meal, Hazel sat on the porch steps, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. The events of the past few weeks seemed almost dreamlike, her escape, finding refuge with the Walshes, the confrontation with Harold. Yet the lingering ache in her body from being dragged across the hayloft was very real, as was the newfound sense of possibility unfurling within her. The screen door creaked and Henry stepped out, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Hazel before settling beside her on the steps, a respectful distance between them. "How are you feeling?" he asked after a comfortable silence. Hazel considered the question, taking a sip of the hot, strong coffee. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It doesn't feel quite real yet that he's gone, that I'm free." Henry nodded. "That's understandable. Freedom can be as daunting as it is liberating, especially when you've been without it for so long." "What happens now?" Hazel asked, voicing the question that had been circling in her mind all day. Henry gazed out at the darkening land, his profile outlined against the last light in the western sky. "That depends on you. You're welcome to stay here as long as you'd like, or if you prefer, I could arrange passage to Denver or further east." The thought of leaving brought an unexpected pang to Hazel's heart. In just a few short weeks, this place had become more of a home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. "I'd like to stay," she said softly, "if that's truly all right with you and Hannah." Henry turned to look at her, a smile warming his features. "More than all right," he assured her. "This place has felt more complete with you here." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Hazel, a place that had been walled off during her years with Harold. She looked down at her coffee cup, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the sudden rush of emotion his words had evoked. "The trial will be difficult," Henry continued, seeming to sense her discomfort. "You'll likely need to testify about what Harold did to you both that night and—" Before, Hazel nodded, her throat tight. The thought of speaking publicly about the abuse she had suffered was terrifying, but she knew it was necessary if Harold was to face true justice. "I'll be with you," Henry promised. "Every step." The days stretched into weeks, and the Walsh ranch settled into a new rhythm with Hazel as a permanent part of the household. Hannah taught her to make soap and candles, skills Hazel had never learned growing up in town. Henry showed her how to keep the ranch accounts, patiently explaining the columns of figures until she felt confident enough to take over the task entirely. The yellow dress was completed and hung in Hazel's closet alongside several others that Hannah had helped her make. For the first time in years, Hazel took pleasure in her appearance. no longer trying to make herself invisible to avoid Harold's criticism or unwanted attention. The preliminary hearing for Harold and his accomplices was held in Willow Creek, a brief affair that determined there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Hazel testified briefly, describing the events of that night but not yet delving into the years of abuse that had preceded it. As summer gave way to autumn, Hazel found herself watching Henry with growing awareness. The way the sun caught in his hair as he worked in the corral, the strength in his hands as he repaired a fence, the gentle way he spoke to his horses, all these things she noticed and tucked away in her heart. Sometimes she caught him watching her too, a warmth in his gaze that made her cheeks flush and her pulse quicken. But he never overstepped the boundaries of propriety, never made her feel unsafe or pressured. One crisp October morning, as frost silvered the grass, Henry announced at breakfast that he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Would you like to come along?" he asked Hazel. "The fall fabrics should be in at the general store by now." Hazel had grown more comfortable with trips to town, though she still felt the weight of curious stares from those who knew her story. "I'd like that," she said. The ride to Willow Creek was pleasant, the autumn air fresh against their faces as the wagon rolled along the well-traveled road. Henry spoke of his plans for the ranch, expanding the herd, perhaps building a new barn come spring. "You've made this place thrive," Hazel observed. "You should be proud." Henry shrugged, though she could see he was pleased by the compliment. "It's good land, just needs proper care and attention." In town, they parted briefly, Henry to check on an order of fence posts, Hazel to examine the new fabrics at the general store. Mrs. Peterson's attitude had warmed considerably since news of Harold's arrest had spread, and she was almost friendly as she showed Hazel the latest shipment from back east. "This deep green would suit you beautifully," she suggested, holding up a bolt of soft wool. "With your coloring, it would be most becoming." Hazel ran her fingers over the fabric, imagining a new winter dress. "It's lovely," she agreed. "I'll take enough for a dress, please, as Mrs. Peterson measured and cut the fabric. The store door opened, and Sheriff Daniels entered, removing his hat as he approached Hazel. "Mrs. Thompson," he greeted her. "Just the person I was hoping to find." Hazel's heart sank. Had something happened with Harold? Had he somehow escaped? Seeing her expression, the sheriff quickly added, "Nothing to worry about, just wanted to let you know that the trial date has been set. 2 weeks from now in the county seat." Hazel nodded, relief washing over her. "Thank you for letting me know." "You'll need to be there to testify," the sheriff continued. "All of it this time, not just that night, but everything that came before." The prospect of publicly recounting years of abuse made Hazel's stomach churn, but she straightened her shoulders. "I understand." "It won't be easy," Sheriff Daniels said, his voice gentler. "But your testimony could ensure he stays behind bars for a good long while." After he left, Hazel completed her purchase in a daze, her mind racing with anxiety about the upcoming trial. Outside the store, she nearly collided with Henry, who was returning from his errand. "Hazel, what's wrong?" he asked immediately, concern evident in his face. "The trial," she managed. "It's in 2 weeks," understanding dawned in Henry's eyes. "Ah, you're worried about testifying." Hazel nodded, clutching her package of fabric. "I've never spoken about it, not all of it, not to anyone." Henry glanced around the busy street, then gestured toward a small cafe. "Let's get some coffee," he suggested. "We can talk." In the quiet corner of the cafe, over steaming cups of coffee and slices of apple pie neither of them touched, Hazel tried to articulate her fears. "It's not just the shame," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. I spent so long convincing myself it wasn't that bad, that I deserved it somehow. Speaking it aloud makes it real in a way I'm not sure I can bear." Henry reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You didn't deserve any of it, Hazel, not one moment." Tears welled in her eyes at the conviction in his voice. "How can you be so sure? You didn't know me then." "I know you now," Henry replied simply. "And I know that no one deserves to be treated as less than human, No one deserves to live in fear. Hazel looked down at their joined hands, drawing strength from his touch. "Will you come with me? To the trial, of course," Henry said without hesitation. "Hannah too, if you'd like." The relief that flooded through her was so intense it left her lightheaded. "Thank you," she whispered. They returned to the ranch as the afternoon shadows lengthened, the wagon laden with supplies for the coming winter. Hannah was waiting on the porch, a letter in her hand and an odd expression on her face. "This came for you," she said, holding out the envelope to Hazel. "Ryder brought it from town." Hazel took the letter, noting the unfamiliar handwriting on the outside. "Who would be writing to me?" "Only one way to find out," Hannah replied with a small smile. Inside the house, Hazel opened the letter with trembling fingers. The contents were brief but shocking: a notice from a Denver law firm informing her that her uncle, her mother's brother, whom she had met only once as a child, had passed away and left her a modest inheritance. "I didn't even know he was still alive," Hazel said, stunned. "I haven't had any contact with my mother's family since I was a girl." Henry, reading over her shoulder, whistled softly. "That's a tidy sum, enough to set yourself up quite comfortably, wherever you choose." The implication hung in the air between them. With this inheritance, Hazel was no longer dependent on the Walsh's charity. She could go anywhere, start a new life on her own terms. "I don't have to decide anything right away," she said carefully, watching Henry's face. "The trial is in 2 weeks and there will be paperwork to sort out." Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. Of course, no rush. But something had shifted between them, a new uncertainty where there had been growing certainty before. That night, Hazel lay awake long into the small hours, contemplating paths that had suddenly opened before her. Denver, with its bustling streets and opportunities. San Francisco, perhaps, where she might truly start fresh, where no one knew her story. Or even back east to Philadelphia or Boston, cities she had read about but never seen. Yet when she imagined these places, they seemed cold and empty compared to the warmth of the Walsh Ranch, with its simple routines and the people who had become so dear to her. The days leading up to the trial passed quickly, filled with preparations for winter and discussions with the lawyer who had sent the letter about her inheritance. Hazel found herself watching Henry more closely, trying to decipher his thoughts about her potential departure. But he maintained a careful distance, as if already preparing himself for her absence. The night before they were to travel to the county seat for the trial, Hazel sat by the fire working on her new green dress, the familiar rhythm of needle and thread soothing her frayed nerves. Hannah had retired early, leaving her alone with Henry, who was reading a newspaper in his usual chair. "Will you miss this place?" Henry asked suddenly, looking up from his paper. "If you decide to go." The question caught Hazel off guard. "I haven't decided to go anywhere yet," she replied carefully. Henry folded the newspaper, setting it aside. "But you're considering it." "Denver, perhaps, or further." Hazel set down her sewing. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "It's overwhelming to suddenly have choices when for so long I had none." "You deserve those choices," Henry said, his voice gentle. "After everything you've been through, you deserve the freedom to decide your own path." "And if my path led me to stay here," Hazel asked, her heart pounding, "would that be welcome?" Henry's eyes met hers, and the intensity in them took her breath away. "More than welcome," he said softly. "But I would never want you to stay out of obligation or gratitude. You owe us nothing, Hazel." "It's not obligation that would keep me here," Hazel said, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "It's something else entirely." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Henry rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her so they were at eye level. "Hazel," he began, then hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I've grown to care for you deeply. But I know how recently you've escaped a terrible situation, and the last thing I want is to make you feel pressured or rushed." Hazel's throat tightened with emotion. This was so different from Harold's possessive demands, so different from anything she had experienced before. "You've never made me feel anything but safe," she assured him. "And respected and valued." Henry took her hands in his touch warm and steady. "You are valued more than I can express." "The trial tomorrow," Hazel said, changing the subject slightly. "I'm afraid of seeing him again." "He can't hurt you anymore," Henry reminded her, "and I'll be right there beside you." What if they don't believe me? The fear that had been gnawing at her for days finally voiced aloud. What if they think I'm exaggerating or that I deserved it somehow? Henry's expression hardened slightly. "Anyone who heard what that man did to you and thought you deserved it wouldn't be worth the breath it took to speak to them. But the judge is a fair man, from what I've heard, and the evidence speaks for itself." Hazel nodded, drawing strength from his conviction. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." Henry's gaze softened, and he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch feather-light. "You don't need to thank me for treating you as you deserve to be treated." The journey to the county seat the next morning was tense and largely silent. Hazel wore her best dress, a deep blue that Hannah had helped her make, and clutched a small reticule containing a handkerchief and the letter about her inheritance. A tangible reminder that she had options, that she was no longer trapped. The courthouse was an imposing building of red brick, larger and grander than anything in Willow Creek. Inside, the smell of polish and paper hung in the air as they were directed to a courtroom on the second floor. Hazel's steps faltered as they approached the door. What if Harold somehow broke free? What if he lunged for her across the courtroom? As if sensing her thoughts, Henry placed a steadying hand at the small of her back. "I won't leave your side," he promised. The courtroom was already half full when they entered curious townsfolk, the families of Harold's accomplices, and several men in suits who Hazel assumed were lawyers. Sheriff Daniels nodded to them from near the front, gesturing to vacant seats behind the prosecution table. As they made their way forward, a side door opened and Harold was led in, his hands shackled before him. Hazel's breath caught in her throat at the sight of him. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished by his time in jail, though the hatred in his eyes as he spotted her burned as fiercely as ever. Henry stepped slightly in front of her, shielding her from Harold's gaze as they took their seats. Hannah sat on Hazel's other side, her hand finding Hazel's and squeezing reassuringly. The proceedings began with the judge entering a stern-faced man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. The charges were read: breaking and entering, assault with intent to kill, attempted kidnapping, and previous counts of assault and battery against Hazel. When it came time for Hazel to testify, she approached the witness stand on legs that felt like water, acutely aware of Harold's burning gaze following her every step. After being sworn in, she faced the prosecutor, a kind-faced man who asked her to recount the events of the night Harold had attacked the Walsh ranch. Hazel spoke clearly, describing the terrifying moments in the barn, Harold's threats, and how Henry had shot him to prevent him from strangling her. The prosecutor nodded encouragingly, then his expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, "I must now ask you about your marriage to the defendant. Can you tell the court about your life with Harold Thompson?" Hazel's throat went dry. She glanced at the gallery, finding Henry's steady gaze, drawing strength from his presence. "It began about 6 months after we were married," she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "He came home drunk and angry about something at work. I don't remember what I said, but suddenly he had me by the throat, pinned against the wall." As she continued speaking, the words came more easily, years of suppressed truth finally finding release. She described the escalating violence, the isolation as Harold cut her off from friends and church, the constant fear that colored her every waking moment. "He broke my arm once," she said, her voice steadier now. "Told the doctor I fell from a horse. He locked me in our root cellar for 2 days when I burnt his dinner. He said," her voice faltered briefly, "he said no one would believe me if I told, that a wife's word means nothing against her husband's." Throughout her testimony, Harold glared at her from the defendant's table, his face contorted with rage. Once, he half rose from his seat, prompting the sheriff to step closer, hand on his pistol. But Hazel kept her eyes fixed either on the prosecutor or on Henry, refusing to be intimidated by the man who had terrorized her for so long. When she finally stepped down from the witness stand, her legs were shaking but her head was high. Henry met her at the gallery gate, offering his arm for support, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and pride. "You did wonderfully," he whispered as they returned to their seats. The defense presented little in the way of evidence, relying primarily on character witnesses who spoke of Harold standing in the community and questioned why. If the abuse was so severe, Hazel hadn't left sooner a question that betrayed a profound ignorance of the dynamics of such situations. In his closing argument, the prosecutor addressed this directly. Mrs. Thompson stayed because she was terrified, isolated, and had nowhere to go, he told the jury. She stayed because her husband had convinced her that no one would believe her, that no one would help her. Let us prove him wrong today. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a verdict, guilty on all counts. Harold's face darkened with rage as the judge sentenced him to 15 years in territorial prison, with similar sentences for his accomplices. As Harold was led away, he twisted in the guard's grip, his hateful gaze finding Hazel. "This isn't over," he shouted. "I'll find you, you'll never be free of me." The guards wrestled him through the door, his threats echoing in the stunned silence of the courtroom. Hazel sat frozen, those familiar words, "this isn't over," ringing in her ears, threatening to unravel the courage she had built. Then Henry's hand found hers, warm and steady. "It is over," he said firmly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun was bright in a clear blue sky. Hazel took a deep breath, feeling as though a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "What would you like to do now?" Henry asked as they walked toward the wagon. "We could stay in town tonight, if you'd prefer not to travel back right away." Hazel considered the offer. The town was larger than Willow Creek, with actual restaurants and a hotel that looked quite comfortable. But all she truly wanted was to return to the quiet sanctuary of the Walsh Ranch. "I'd like to go home," she said, then realized what she had revealed in those simple words. The ranch had become home in a way no place had been since childhood. Henry's eyes warmed at her choice of words. "Home it is, then." The journey back was lighter somehow, as if the resolution of the trial had cleared the air between them. They talked easily of everyday things the coming winter, plans for spring planting, a new calf born just before they'd left for the trial. It was nearly sunset when they arrived at the ranch, the western sky ablaze with gold and crimson. Hannah had stayed behind to care for the animals, and she greeted them eagerly, wanting to hear every detail of the trial and its outcome. Over a simple dinner, Hazel recounted the day's events, finding that speaking of it now was easier, the sharp edges of the experience already beginning to dull with distance. "So he'll be locked away for 15 years, Hannah said with satisfaction. "By then, he'll be an old man, and you'll have built a whole new life." The observation hung in the air, reminding them all of the decision Hazel had yet to make regarding her inheritance and her future. After dinner, as Hannah cleared the dishes, Henry suggested a walk to clear their heads after the long day. The evening was cool but not cold, the first stars appearing in the darkening eastern sky as they strolled toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the Walsh property. "Have you given more thought to what you might do?" Henry asked as they reached the bank, the burbling water a soothing counterpoint to their conversation. "With your inheritance, I mean." Hazel watched the water flowing over smooth stones, reflecting the last light in the sky. "I have," she admitted. "I've thought of little else these past days." Henry waited, his patience one of the qualities she had come to admire most about him. "I could go to Denver," she said, thinking aloud, "or further, start fresh somewhere no one knows me or my history." Henry nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "You could." "Or," Hazel continued, her heart pounding, "I could stay here, Perhaps by the old Macready place. It's still standing empty, you said. Henry turned to face her fully, surprise and something like hope in his eyes. You'd want to stay so close. Hazel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I'd want to stay closer than that, if I'm being honest. Understanding dawned in Henry's face, followed by a warmth that took her breath away. Hazel, he said softly, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that I've found something here I never thought to find again, she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Safety, yes, but also purpose, belonging, and something more, something I'm only just beginning to recognize. Henry stepped closer, his hands gentle as they took hers. And what is that something more? Love, Hazel whispered, the word both terrifying and liberating. Not the desperate, clinging thing I thought was love with Harold, but something deeper, steadier. Henry's smile was like the sunrise, gradual and beautiful. I've been afraid to speak of it, he admitted, afraid you'd think it too soon, or that I was taking advantage of your situation. You've never taken advantage, Hazel assured him. You've only ever offered choice and respect. And time to heal, to find myself again. And have you, Henry asked, found yourself? Hazel considered the question seriously. I'm finding her, she said. Pieces that were lost, parts of me I'd forgotten existed. It's a process, I think, not a destination. Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then I'll walk beside you on that journey if you'll allow it, not to lead or direct, but to support. I'd like that very much, Hazel said, her voice catching on the words. The space between them seemed to shrink, the cool evening air warming with unspoken possibility. Henry's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, a question in his expression. Hazel answered by rising on tiptoe, her hands coming to rest lightly on his shoulders as she pressed her lips to his in a kiss that was gentle but full of promise. When they pulled apart, Henry's eyes were bright with emotion. I've wanted to do that for a long time, he confessed. So have I, Hazel admitted. I just wasn't sure if I should, if I was ready. And are you? Henry asked. Ready, I mean. Hazel smiled, a genuine smile that felt like a revelation after years of forcing her expression to match Harold's expectations. I'm ready to begin, she said. To see where this path leads us. Hand in hand, they walked back to the house, where warm light spilled from the windows and Hannah waited with coffee and pie, her knowing smile suggesting she had anticipated this outcome long before either of them had acknowledged it. Winter descended on the Colorado Territory with a series of fierce storms that blanketed the land in white and kept them largely homebound. Hazel found she didn't mind the confinement. The Walsh home was warm and full of simple pleasures, books to read, sewing and knitting by the fire, long conversations that stretched into the evening hours. Her relationship with Henry deepened gradually, each day bringing new discoveries about the man she was coming to love. His patience with skittish calves, his unexpected talent for sketching landscapes, the way he hummed tunelessly while he worked, all these things she collected like treasures. They were careful with physical affection, both aware of Hazel's need to proceed at her own pace. Kisses were exchanged, hands held, but Henry never pushed for more, content to let their relationship unfold naturally. In January, a letter arrived from the lawyer handling her uncle's estate, informing Hazel that the paperwork was complete and the inheritance funds were available for her use. The letter sat on her bedside table for days, as she contemplated what to do with this unexpected windfall. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, and the three of them sat by the fire engaged in their usual pursuits, Hannah knitting, Henry reading, Hazel working on embroidery, she made her decision. I'd like to use part of my inheritance to invest in the ranch, she announced, setting aside her embroidery hoop. Both Henry and Hannah looked up in surprise. That's not necessary, Henry began, but Hazel raised a hand to stop him. I know it isn't necessary, she said. But I want to contribute, to be a true partner in building something here. You've talked about expanding the herd, adding a new barn. My inheritance could help make those plans reality sooner. Henry studied her face, seeming to search for any sign of obligation or pressure. Finding none, he nodded slowly. A partnership, he said, testing the word. Yes, Hazel confirmed, a full partnership. The implication hung in the air between them, understood by all three. Hannah was the first to break the silence, her knitting needles clicking as she resumed her work. "Well, it's about time," she said with a smile. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever." Henry laughed, the sound warm in the cozy room. "Was I that obvious? Both of you were," Hannah replied, like two people tiptoeing around a sleeping bear, afraid to wake it. Hazel smiled at the analogy. Perhaps that was what they had been doing, cautiously navigating around the trauma of her past, fearful of triggering painful memories or moving too quickly. "The bear is awake now," she said softly, "and not nearly as frightening as I feared." Later that night, after Hannah had retired, Henry and Hazel sat together on the sofa, the fire burning low in the grate. Outside, the storm had quieted, leaving a hushed stillness broken only by the occasional settling of logs in the fireplace. "Did you mean what you said?" Henry asked, his arm warm around her shoulders. "About a partnership," Hazel nodded, leaning into his solid presence. "I did, in every sense of the word." Henry shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket. "I've been carrying this for weeks," he admitted, pulling out a small, worn velvet box. "Waiting for the right moment, or perhaps for my own courage." Hazel's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the firelight and scattered it in tiny rainbows. "It was my mother's," Henry explained. "She gave it to me before she died, said to save it for the right woman." He met Hazel's gaze, his eyes full of emotion. "I can think of no one more right than you, Hazel, if you'll have me." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll have you, Henry Walsh." The ring slid onto her finger as if it had been made for her, the gold warm against her skin. Henry's kiss was tender, a seal on a promise that neither took lightly. "We'll take our time," he assured her. "No rush to the altar, spring, perhaps, or summer." Hazel nodded, grateful for his understanding. Though she was certain of her love for Henry, the idea of marriage still carried echoes of her experience with Harold. Time would help separate the institution from the man who had perverted it. The winter months passed in a blur of contentment and planning. With Hazel's inheritance, they ordered additional cattle to be delivered in the spring, contracted for lumber to build a new barn, and even discussed adding a room to the house. Hannah, far from feeling displaced by Hazel's increasing role in her brother's life, seemed delighted by the developments. "I've been telling him for years he needs a wife," she confided to Hazel one afternoon as they preserved apples. "Someone to share the load and warm his bed." Hazel blushed at the frank reference to marital intimacy, a topic she still found difficult to discuss. Her experiences with Harold had left physical relations tainted with fear and revulsion, a fact she had yet to fully address with Henry. Hannah, perceptive as always, noticed her discomfort. "He'll be patient," she assured Hazel. "Henry understands more than you might think." "What do you mean?" Hazel asked, curious despite her embarrassment. Hannah was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh her words. "Our mother," she finally said, "lived with a similar situation before she met our father. Her first husband was cruel. She never spoke of it directly, but we understood as we got older. It shaped how Henry sees things, how he treats women." This revelation added another layer to Hazel's understanding of the man she had agreed to marry. It explained his innate sensitivity to her boundaries, his careful approach to physical affection. "I do love him," Hazel said softly, "more than I thought possible." Hannah smiled, her hands continuing their work with the apples. "I know, and he loves you. The rest will come in time." Spring arrived in a riot of wildflowers and new growth, the ranch coming alive after the long winter. The new cattle were delivered, sturdy stock that would strengthen their herd. Construction began on the barn, the sound of hammering a constant backdrop to their days. As the wedding date approached set for early June, when the wildflowers would be at their peak, Hazel found herself increasingly preoccupied with the physical aspects of marriage. She loved Henry's kisses, his gentle touches, but the thought of complete intimacy still filled her with apprehension. One evening, as they walked by the creek, now rushing with spring meltwater, Hazel gathered her courage to broach the subject. "Henry," she began hesitantly, "there's something we should discuss before the wedding." Henry slowed his pace, giving her his full attention. "Anything," he said. Hazel took a deep breath. "It's about the marriage bed." The words came out in a rush, her cheeks flaming. "With Harold, it was never. It was just another form of control, of pain. I'm afraid I won't be the wife you deserve in that way." Henry's expression softened with understanding. He took her hands in his touch as always gentle and respectful. "Hazel, listen to me. Marriage is about partnership, friendship, building a life together. Yes, physical intimacy is part of that, but it's not the foundation. But you deserve, what I deserve," Henry interrupted gently, "is a wife who feels safe and valued. Nothing will happen between us that you don't want or aren't ready for. We have a lifetime ahead of us. There's no rush." Tears welled in Hazel's eyes at his understanding. "I do want to be a real wife to you," she whispered. "I'm just afraid." Henry drew her closer, his arms encircling her in a warm embrace. "Fear is natural after what you've been through, but we'll face it together at your pace. Always." The day of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect June day that seemed created for celebration. The ceremony was small but meaningful, held in the garden behind the house, where Hannah had planted additional flowers for the occasion. The pastor from Willow Creek officiated, his words emphasizing partnership and mutual respect in a way that spoke directly to Hazel's heart. Henry, handsome in a new suit, watched her with such love in his eyes that her earlier fears receded, replaced by a quiet certainty that this marriage would be nothing like her first. Hannah had helped her make a new dress for the occasion, ivory silk with delicate embroidery that had taken weeks to complete. As she spoke her vows, Hazel felt transformed not just by the dress, but by the journey that had brought her to this moment, from terrified, abused wife to a woman standing tall, choosing her own path forward. The small gathering of guests' neighbors, friends from town, even Sheriff Daniels and his wife shared a meal afterward, tables set up in the yard under the shade of the cottonwood trees. There was music and dancing, laughter and good wishes, all the elements of celebration that had been absent from Hazel's first wedding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, the guests departed, leaving the newlyweds and Hannah alone. With a knowing smile, Hannah announced that she would be spending the night with their nearest neighbors, giving the couple privacy for their first night as husband and wife. After she left, a momentary awkwardness descended, both Hazel and Henry aware of the expectations of a wedding night but careful of the conversations they had shared. "Would you like to sit on the porch for a while?" Henry suggested, sensing Hazel's nervousness. "Watch the stars come out." Gratitude flooded through her at his sensitivity. "I'd like that," she agreed. They sat side by side in the gathering dusk, hands intertwined, speaking of small things, how well the garden was growing, a new foal born just days before, plans for harvesting the hay in the lower field. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Hazel felt a sense of peace settle over her. This man beside her, now her husband, had shown her nothing but respect and care. With him, she was safe to explore her feelings, to rediscover aspects of herself long suppressed. "Henry," she said softly, turning to face him in the starlight, "I'm ready to go inside now." His eyes searched hers, finding certainty where there had been hesitation before. "You're sure?" Hazel nodded, rising from her chair and extending her hand to him. "I'm sure." In the privacy of what was now their bedroom, lit only by the soft glow of a lamp, Henry was as good as his word. Each touch was a question, each advance preceded by a look that asked permission. Hazel found herself responding not with the fear she had expected, but with a gradually awakening desire. This, she realized, was how it was meant to be between a man and a woman, tender, mutual, an expression of love rather than dominance. When they finally joined as husband and wife, it was a coming together of equals, each giving and receiving in turn. Afterward, lying in the circle of Henry's arms, Hazel felt tears slip from beneath her closed eyelids, not tears of pain or shame, but of release and healing. "Are you all right?" Henry asked, concerned, brushing the moisture from her cheeks. "More than all right," Hazel assured him. "I'm whole. For the first time in so long, I feel whole." Henry pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You always were whole," he murmured, "just wounded, and wounds heal with time and proper care." As she drifted towards sleep, Hazel reflected on the journey that had brought her here, from a terrified woman fleeing in the night to a bride welcomed into loving arms. The path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led her home. 5 years later, Hazel stood on the porch of the Walsh Ranch, now officially the Walsh and Thompson Ranch, according to the new sign at the entrance, watching her husband work with their 3-year-old son in the garden. Little James had his father's patient nature and his mother's curiosity, a combination that made him both a joy and a handful. "Mama, look," he called, holding up a carrot he had helped pull from the ground. "I growed it." "You certainly did," Hazel called back with a smile. "That's a fine carrot." "We'll have it with dinner." Hannah emerged from the house behind her, balancing 9-month-old Emma on her hip. "That boy has dirt from head to toe," she observed with a laugh. Just like his father at that age. Hazel took her daughter, breathing in the sweet baby scent. "And this one will be just the same once she's walking. Mark my words." The years had brought changes to all of them. The ranch had prospered, expanding to include the old McCready property and additional acreage to the north. The original house had been enlarged, adding not only the room they had planned but a proper study for Henry, and a sewing room where Hazel created clothing not just for her family, but for sale in town. Hannah had surprised them all 2 years ago by marrying the widowed doctor from Willow Creek, though she had insisted on maintaining her own home on the ranch rather than moving to town. "One foot in each world suits me fine," she had declared. As for Harold, they had received word 3 years ago that he had died in prison pneumonia, according to the official notice. Hazel had felt a complex mixture of emotions at the news. Relief, certainly, but also a strange, brief pang of something like grief. Not for the man he had been to her, but for the waste of a life consumed by rage and control. The inheritance that had once seemed her ticket to freedom had instead become the foundation for building something meaningful right where she was. The money had been invested wisely, in land and livestock, in improvements that made the ranch one of the most successful in the county. But the true wealth, Hazel reflected as she watched her husband swing their son onto his shoulders, lay in the family they had created together. A family built on mutual respect and genuine love, where voices were never raised in anger, where differences were discussed rather than punished. Henry caught her watching and smiled, that same warm smile that had first given her hope on a dusty road at twilight. He set James down and approached the porch, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" he asked. Hazel leaned into his touch, shifting Emma to her other hip. "About how far we've come, about choices and second chances." Henry nodded, understanding as always. "Any regrets, about staying, about building our life here?" Hazel shook her head, absolute certainty in her voice as she replied, "Not a single one." James tugged at his father's pants leg, impatient for attention. Henry swung him up into his arms, balancing him easily as he leaned in to kiss Hazel softly. "Good," he said against her lips. "Because I plan to keep you safe here for at least 50 more years." Hazel smiled, the words echoing across time from that first night on the road, when a stranger had offered shelter and changed the course of her life. "I'm counting on it," she replied, and followed her husband into the house that had become, against all odds, the home her heart had always sought.